All right. Hello, Mackenzie.
Hi.
Thank you for being on the podcast.
Of course.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. So today we're speaking about humanity and how it plays into healing. So first off, let's start. What's lacking in medicine in terms of humanity?
That's a great question. I think humanness. Sometimes when we walk into the room with our white coats on and the patient sees us, I think sometimes they assume that we're like either subhuman or more than human, and reminding patients that we are human and bringing that humanity back into the medicine and back into that patient interaction. I think that that's definitely lacking. I know that we talked a little bit earlier about the wearing of the white coat and how it can sometimes feel too sterile, but I think that we can wear a white coat and walk the walk, and then also talk the talk, and bringing that humanity back into the patient visit and back into that patient interaction.
Right.
Between doctor-patient.
The white coat, it has this long history of use. So it's almost taking on of a certain symbol. To certain people, the white coat means, God complex and oppression and patriarchy. And to other people in different communities, it means, very educated person who knows what's going on. And that symbol means different things to different people. So the question is, how can these symbols add to the humanness of the profession or take away from it?
Well, I think it depends on who is wearing that white coat and their interactions. My interactions with a patient as a student and then in the future as a doctor are going to be very different than someone else's. And so I think it's up to each individual to take on those roles. When they're putting on the white coat, it's more than just being a professional. It's bringing that humanity back in. And I think that's something that we need to continue doing more of in naturopathic medicine, but then in all other spheres of medicine as well.
I think of it in a very ritual way. Like a magician puts on.
Yes.
Whenever I put on the white coat, I always get like a kind of feeling of like, okay, now I must act like a physician. This is like not me personally. This is me almost like fulfilling a role or something.
Yeah.
So it has its usefulness in terms of that, but then it also separates.
Yeah.
It separates people.
Well, I don't think that you should feel weird about like being you and being who you are just because you have a white coat on. I think it's good because it does kind of create a little bit of a barrier and a separation so that you're able to be the best doctor and provide the best care that you possibly can. I think that's really important. But just like I've heard a lot of people saying recently, don't be fake online. Who you are on Instagram or in the social media sphere should also be who you are in real life too, Like how terrible would it be to meet somebody that you really revere online and you meet them in person and they suck and they're boring and they're terrible, right?
Yeah, and they're like social media is like them doing all these crazy things, then you meet them in person, they're just like really shy and reserved, and you're like
You're lying to me. That was all a lie, right? And I don't want that to be what happens when I put on my white coat and I go into a room and work with a patient.
I see your point. So
and
it's
I don't want to take away from them or their experiences or what's going on with them, but I want them to know that it's human talking to human.
Right. There seems to be a kind of fine balance of what you bring personally into it, because you don't want to be like a robot, like a sterile robot that's like, this is the diagnosis and this is the treatment, because healing fundamentally is like a healing relationship.
Right.
So if there's no relationship, then there's no healing.
Exactly.
And I think that's like the most common critique of modern healthcare is the fact that doctors spend so little time with patients, that they're so disconnected, that they're so overworked, that it feels like, they're just a car and they're going to get treated.
Yes.
That works for cars very well. But the issue with people is that with all these different like mind-body effects, some people call it placebo effect or the ritual effect and things like that, that interaction is actually part of what heals them.
Yes.
So to strip that out and say like, we focus on only evidence-based usage. So like, it's like you come in and like, we give you this thing and then that's it. That's all the healing encounter is.
But what about the N of 1? I always want to talk about that too. We talk about evidence-based medicine so much, and I think it's really important and it really has its place. But there are lots of N of 1 situations that we should also be including in our EBM too, if possible.
Absolutely,
and if applicable, right? There's always caveats to that, but
well, that's holistic medicine in a nutshell.
Yes.
It's always N of 1, because the theory is that every person is significantly enough of an individual that you have to treat them in a different way than anyone else.
Right.
So like 10 people with diabetes have diabetes for different reasons. So you can't just give every of them the same medication.
Exactly.
Although that is the approach in the more conventional system, which has its own merits, because for a bunch of those patients it will work. For some of them it won't work at all.
And then those are often the patients that end up in a naturopathic doctor's office, right? So we don't want to continue perpetuating what happened to them before, most definitely. And I'm not quite sure what can be accomplished in 15 minutes with a person in a visit, you know, like you're going to get some vitals, you're going to get some vital information, but you might not be getting the whole picture, you might not be getting the whole story. And going back to what you said about humanity, I think too, we don't want to take away from the patient's experience, and we don't want to bring in too much of our own baggage and too much of our own crap, and we don't want to take away from the patient by doing that. But letting them know that we are human. There are a lot of people who do cancer treatments who are also cancer survivors, naturopathic doctors, and they get so much more credit when they tell their patients that they have had cancer or that they're a cancer survivor. And why do you think that is? You know, I think it's bringing that humanity back into medicine, and it's not making it be all about the doctor or all about the doctor's crap, but letting the patient know, hey, you know, I see you, I'm with you, we're on the same level here, we're both humans. I might have a shit ton of education, but at the end of the day, we're both humans.
How do you personally humanize healing? Everyone has their own methodology. I'm interested in hearing how you make it more human. Human. Oh, human.
No,
oh, okay.
I bring in humor, yeah. When appropriate. There's a time and a place, right? Yeah. But humor is also a really good sign of vitality. And that's something that really resonated with me. Obviously, I'm not applying humor in every situation, but sometimes it's really great, especially with adolescents or children, you know, or the patient or the parent's really nervous. And if we can get everybody to just laugh and then get past that nervousness and past that barrier, that has been really helpful for me in certain situations. And I think sometimes verbalizing, like, oh, yeah, I hear you. Or I understand. Wow, that must be really hard. So validating. I think validation is really key. Humans love validation. I mean, I love validation. I think that's different from enabling. I'm not saying that we want to necessarily enable, but validating and letting that patient know that you see them and that you hear them and that you believe them and what they're bringing to the table and their symptoms and their complaints, that they're real. That's been also really helpful.
Yeah, there's a very common dismissive attitude. The whole, you know, hypochondria thing. It's interesting that most of the people that I see may be considered hypochondriacs, but I think they're considered hypochondriacs not because they actually are, but because there's no really medical explanation from within the conventional system.
They don't fit into that rubric. And in the conventional system, folks struggle with dealing with them, and so then they're automatically
because they don't know what to do, because they may not have the tools for dealing with it. Exactly. And that's okay. That's not their focus. No. But to
write them off,
or put them in like a bad place and make them doubt their own experience.
Exactly. Because at the end of the day, it's an experience, and we have to validate that. We have to show up for that and show up for the patient in all of their entirety.
That's the stuff that really interests me anyway. I've always been very interested in psychology. So even if it's like a case of so-called hypochondria, so what? Like, let's figure out what the actual cause of them, you know, creating these symptoms are for themselves. Yeah. That's interesting. That's very interesting stuff. And we were speaking about this previously. The medical profession has taken out a lot of the humanities out of it. Like, there's no really philosophy of medicine. It's kind of just based on, you know, empiricism and science. All these ancient practices of like dream interpretation and like prophesizing and all these different ways that they would connect more with a person are considered like, we're so like far beyond that. But like, I don't think our psyches have changed very much in like thousands of years. And I think that's one of the reasons why there's so like little sometimes meaning within the healing interaction.
I think everything that you just mentioned has a place somewhere. But I think to completely dismiss those things and not even interact with them is a mistake. I think when we walk away from things like dream interpretation or like astrology, whether or not there's evidence behind it, it's been something that's been a part of so many different cultures for so long. To kind of just cut it out, I think would be silly. Even if it is just placebo, right? We still know that there's so much importance there, and there's so much healing that can happen just with placebo.
That's my issue with the just placebo. It's very dismissive of the fact that there's this strange phenomenon going on. Wouldn't it be better to understand what it is so we can use it on purpose
and wield it and have it
and that's
be
what the
productive.
shamans were doing, from my understanding, is they were working with that force, but a force that causes physiological change. How fake can it be considered?
Exactly. And that also brings us to, we talk about black holes and we talk about quantum science. Just because we can't see something or feel it, it doesn't mean that it's not real or it doesn't exist. And so I think taking that out of the picture is just really silly and stupid of us. Like, just because we've never seen a black hole or like don't understand that there might be black matter, it doesn't mean that it doesn't exist and it's not a real thing. And so I kind of feel the same way about working with dreams and things that might be a little bit more underneath the surface, or working with the subconscious. You know, maybe that's not my wheelhouse and that's not what I'm really, really good at, but I don't think that anybody should be poo-pooed for doing that kind of stuff.
There's certainly many interesting things that if they're immediately dismissed, they're kind of lost.
Right.
So we were speaking about when we were sitting the other day about astral projection.
Oh yeah.
It's the strangest thing for anyone who's ever experienced it. Everyone experiences it in a different sense, but the gist of it is that it's kind of like a dream state, but you end up out of your body, looking around in a room somewhere, maybe like at home or some other place, and you realize that you're like in this state. And I was telling you previously that what I found is that there's certain like almost like physics laws in it. Like at nighttime you get like pulled into the ground, and daytime there's like an upward force, and you can't move through walls. It's like if it's a dream, it's a different kind of dream. People in the kind of more occult studies have always kind of looked into that. My question is like, how true can science really be if it doesn't take into account strange, unexplainable things rather than just dismissing them?
I think that's the question of the century, if not the millennia. We're really obsessed with science, and I think science is really great, and I love science, and I love facts, but sometimes there are things that we cannot explain, and I don't think that just because we can't explain them, we should dismiss them and pretend like they don't exist. I think that's stupid. And that's not a good approach. Like, why would we do that? It's kind of feels like we're narrowing things down more than we should. Like, why would we want our view to be this big when it can be this big? That doesn't mean we're always recognizing or interacting with the things over here, but like I want to see all of it.
It's also not scientific. I think it's more of like scientism, where it's like this kind of dogma or religion of like, this is the only kind of evidence that could be considered truth. It's actually really a deep philosophical belief, but it's touted kind of as being like, this is the way, which is exactly how the early Christianity was like, this is the only way, and everyone else. It's like, it has a similar kind of religious kind of zeal feel to me when I look at it. When I always find it very interesting that the people we think of as, the great scientists who created science, Paracelsus, he worked way more on alchemy than he ever did on chemistry, which is what kind of it became. Or Newton, right? So Newton, he's thought of, the founder of Newtonian physics, but I read some statistic that he wrote like 3 times more books on alchemy than he did in physics. And the story goes that a lot of these kind of inspirational leaders in science and really innovators had like deep mystical beliefs and feelings, but like the times have separated that aspect and been like just taken what they produced and been like, this is actually the truth. And I think that's why we're almost like trapped, instead of recognizing that there's a kind of like dual view where like science and religion can actually coexist.
Yeah.
If viewed properly.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think in undergrad, I remember having to write a paper or a statement or something regarding science versus religion and how we have kind of come to this dichotomy. And I don't necessarily disagree with the dichotomy. And religion is such a touchy subject for a lot of folks too, but it is really interesting that, well, I don't know if I call alchemy, like a lot of it was and is still based in fact and is like very tangible, right? But that does bring us back to like, just because we can't see it or we can't feel it or we can't like quantify it, that therefore it does not exist, you know?
Things were kind of cherry picked out of alchemy and turned into chemistry because a lot of the processes they were working with, they were actually working with chemicals. They were doing all these processes, but their fundamental difference of view was that they believed that they weren't just discovering facts, they were discovering almost like psychological or spiritual truths from working with things. So like they understood, you know, they would do these operations with this and that chemical and it would do this and that, and they would view it as like, this is like what this is how the psyche works, because matter and the mind are not really separate. So like the more we study it, the more we understand ourselves.
And in a
which
lot
is
of
completely
ways,
different than
I feel like
science.
medicine is very spiritual too. I mean, like I wouldn't want to be a healer or a naturopathic doctor if I did not feel some immense connection to it, right? It wouldn't be fulfilling for me. It wouldn't really be a passion of mine. And so I think to take those feelings out of the equation would be detrimental to me as a practitioner, a future practitioner, and being able to actually heal people and help people. Because then, again, I become a robot and I don't have that humanity. So I think that spirituality aspect in any person's spiritual practices, whether they call them religious or not, is a part of that health and that healing and medicine. And that's why we're trained in school to ask people, you know, are you religious? Are you spiritual? And what do those practices look like for you? And what does that support system or that community look like for you? And mindfulness, you know, mindfulness is such a powerful healing tool. And evidence shows us, you know, we have that evidence-based medicine there that supports that. So I think we can't really take the spirituality or that feeling of a spiritual experience out of medicine, nor should we, like, because that's kind of what it's been historically speaking. And just recently, the last 100, 200 years, it's kind of morphed into something different.
Absolutely, yeah.
But that also, too, is going to be, and this is the humanity piece, it's going to be different for every single patient that walks in through the door, right? I can be as woo or as not woo as the patient wants me to be. Whatever they need in that moment or in that visit or for their healing journey, that's kind of where I meet them at, you know? And that goes back into the humanity piece. It's meeting the patient where they're at too. And do we see that in other areas of medicine? Maybe not. But I think that's a huge piece. And I think that's a huge piece of what naturopathic medicine is and does that kind of sets us apart too.
So what is the spirituality of naturopathic medicine? Because there's so many different views, right?
Yeah. I think...
where do you think it like stems from, and what?
Indigenous practices and indigenous medicine.
So more kind of like, almost like pagan, like nature worship.
And indigenous peoples, I think they cultivated spiritual relationships with plants and were able to communicate with plants and or work with plants, and they perceived it as communicating, however you want to call it. I think that then morphed into what we have now, because, you know, aspirin comes from a plant, Valium comes from a plant, you know, we were able to isolate all these really great compounds from plants, but those
that
folks
original,
did that.
Spiritual connection, it was kind of separated out, and I think it's a big disservice to medicine to take that aspect out, because
and to those groups of peoples too. Like, you know, I know at our school and in naturopathic medicine we try our best to not forget about those peoples, but I think that that's not true of all medicine as a field.
It's interesting too that in our education, although we are thought of as people that are more on the spiritual side of medicine, we're not really overtly taught anything about spirituality, because there's kind of this approach of like hands off. It's like touchy, don't. But I wonder if that's really the best approach, or if there's a way to get to what it's what spirituality is aiming at without all the kind of religious trappings and like building
think
awareness,
that's hard.
self-knowledge, and these things that are helpful for any profession.
Exactly.
Especially when you're dealing with fundamental human issues.
Yes.
Not like inanimate objects.
Yeah. I think that's the work that has to be done within each individual who is working in the field of medicine. Because I think that looks so different for every single person.
Yeah.
And what that practice is or what those beliefs are going to be so different from person to person. But I think each individual needs to kind of take that upon themselves, you know, and that goes along with putting on the white coat. It's like, okay, how am I going to do this? And where do my beliefs and my spirituality or all those things kind of play into that?
Paracelsus, the great Swiss alchemist, says that there's 3 types of physicians that exist. One is physician by family, so they have a family lineage of being a physician. Another is a physician by learning, so like they don't have any family relation, but they like just learned medicine so much that now they're could be considered a healer. And the third type, he says, and he was very religious, he talks a lot about God. He says the third type is the physician that's chosen by like God or spirit, that it's like a spiritual calling for that person. And I think that that's like a lot of the difference in people how they practice, because one physician will say, oh, the spiritual world is not like part of our scope of practice, like we're focused on the body. But for other people they'll say no, like that's actually the most important part of the practice.
I think that's up to the patient too. Like when I become a practitioner, if I'm presented with that question or if that kind of comes into the conversation, I can offer resources, I can make referrals, I can direct. Would that be something I would want to take on personally? Probably not, I guess, depending on the patient, but I'm not going to not talk about it or not allow it to be talked about or not allow it to be a part of the healing journey for that patient, because I feel like that's me doing a disservice to them. You know, if that's what they want and that's what they need, although I might not be able to provide it, I can point them in the direction of someone who can. Like, that's my duty and that's my job.
So at its core, spirituality and religions are just a way for humans to reach meaning. So if you strip that out, and
to probably connect with each other too.
Right, it does foster community because it's like part of something bigger. But it's really answers to the fundamental questions of life, like why are we here? What's the purpose of life? What is like my human life for? Is this the only world that exists? And these are important questions that you can't separate out from the healing process. For example, someone who doesn't have anything to live for, why would they want to get healthy? If they don't fundamentally like the life they live, they don't enjoy their life, they may in a lot of cases secretly sabotage themselves, like by slow suicide kind of ways, like eating terribly, smoking cigarettes, drinking too much, doing all these acts that they know are wrong to their body, that they know they're harming their body, but they don't really care because sometimes they lack meaning in their life. So you can take all those away, but it doesn't actually fix the fundamental problem. And I think that's where the so-called spiritual aspect comes in. It's like, if a person doesn't have a purpose in their life, they'll never want to be healthy because they'll have nothing to live for. And anyone who's ever become like inspired by something they were doing, health like becomes such a big focus, because it's like, if you have a mission, you figure out this is my mission on the earth, this is what I want to do. You want to be there for it. You want to be healthy because you have a more positive view towards life, not like I'm trying to prevent myself from dying, but like I want to really live. But if we don't address that piece, how can we address anything lifestyle related? Yeah,
I agree. And I think that is also often why naturopathic doctors get patients, because
it's a big reason.
And the other doctors are like, well, we don't know what to do with you. This is, we don't have any tools for you. So I think that there's a place for us in that, in medicine, for that reason specifically too. Like, we can be great primary care physicians when we graduate, because right now we're just students. But I think being able to wield all these different tools and these different options, or just laying it out for the patient, here's what we've got, what do you want to do, or where do you want to start, or what do you want this to look like? I think that's so powerful too, in empowering that patient and kind of giving them that back when they might feel like it's been taken from them. And I think I had a thought and it slipped me. Oh, a lot of times people talk about their calling in life, and we take that very seriously too. But it's interesting that Paracelsus, did I say it right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you did.
Said that there's 3 different, I hope so.
He has a really long name, by the way. He's like Theophrastus Bombastus von Hohenheim. Paracelsus is just a nickname he was given. Anyway.
Jeez.
Yeah, it's a very long name.
And he said that there's the 3 different kinds of physicians. But a lot of times people do things, whether it's being a physician or not, because they feel called to do that work. And we hear that and we take that very seriously. So it's kind of interesting that even though it is what we would consider to be a spiritual calling, we take that seriously when a person says that. But then we don't take issues of health that might be spiritually related, or there might be some more subconscious work that needs to be done there. We don't always take that seriously. So it's just this dichotomy, and we often see that in science and in medicine. We see it all the time, but it's just interesting that you brought that up, and it's like...
There's a lot of evidence of that being true. This is the super classic story of the person diagnosed with terminal cancer that decides, you know what, for my last month, I'm just going to live the life I've always wanted to live. They might go to Peru and do ayahuasca or something.
Yeah.
A year later, they're still alive.
Here. Yeah.
A couple of years later, still alive.
And they're a medical anomaly. Ooh.
Yeah.
Right, yeah.
Right, but that's exactly the thing. Is it really a medical anomaly, or did they heal themselves by finding the purpose in their life, and that
or healing the parts of them that needed to be healed that nobody else could address or figure out. Right.
That we're also manifesting physiologically as like a cancer.
Right. And that's the other thing too that's really crazy. We talk about stress. Stress is really inflammatory. And it kind of starts in our brain, right? Like that's where we first experience or first recognize the stress, but then the stress actually does manifest as things that we can physically see and that someone walks into the doctor's office with as a chief complaint. So
it's all in
how
the
do
minds.
we separate? You know, I feel like that's unfair, and that's unfair to our patients too to try and separate. But again, too, like maybe that's not my wheelhouse, and that's not what I'm going to wield as my superpower as a future doctor. But to cut it out of the conversation is stupid. Like, let's not do that anymore.
Absolutely. And there's some research around what harmful stress is. And basically the kind of unanimous thing that's found is that stress is always perceived.
Oh, yeah.
It's how the stress is perceived. So like stress happens regardless, but how it's perceived affects how it's taken physiologically. So like if you go to work out at the gym, you put your body under a lot of stress.
Yeah.
But you feel great after, and it has great benefits for your body. This is a little bit of an extreme example, but let's say you're forced to work or you're forced to labor because you feel like this is like wrong and that doesn't have meaning for you, that will deteriorate your body.
Right.
One event they call it like eustress, stress, like good stress, they call it. But good stress is just a question of perception. It's not, there's no good or bad stress inherently. It's what's viewed. And I think
there's
that's
also
where the meaning comes in.
The conversation of hormesis as well when it comes to that stress, and that there's going to be this the biphasic reaction, and that's what hormesis is. But I do think that the stresses that we're also encountering now are very different than what we've historically encountered for the last couple of years.
That's very
and
true.
I think our body too is trying to figure out how the heck do we work with that.
Right.
So it's so different.
Well, yeah, that's a very good point, that there's the perception, but there also is some kind of good stress and bad stress external to us. So there's the stress of like working at a 9-to-5 you hate, and there's the stress of like starting a business that like you love.
Right.
That's like
Very
might
different.
even be more work.
Yeah.
But this one's energizing.
Right.
And the other one is like soul killing. But
And
like
I think too,
it's the same amount of effort, but it's
right.
So that's the weird thing about it.
And then that's too where our psyche and our mind comes in,
Exactly.
and what we're perceiving. But we have to remember what we were made to do. We were made to like be a bunch of nomads running around with spears, right?
Sounds fun.
It does, yeah, maybe. I don't know. Saber-toothed tiger is not my thing.
Yeah.
But that's kind of what we have been evolved. Like that's our strong suit. And then now recently we're trying to move away from that, which is fine, but we're adjusting, and we're trying to, our bodies and evolution, Darwin, we're trying to figure out what that looks like for us. And
I don't think we've really figured that out yet.
No.
In fact, I think a lot of the illness we're seeing is a result of that that disconnect from our biology, because our society and culture and technology has changed so rapidly.
Yes.
But we're pretty much still
We're
the
the same,
cavemen.
yeah.
Like physiologically
Right.
speaking,
Yes.
we're the same exact humans.
Our eyes
more or
might be
less.
getting bigger and our heads might be getting bigger.
We're turning into aliens.
This
probably.
part of our brain is getting
turning
bigger
into
slowly.
Roswells.
Yeah, we're going to have huge heads eventually. But I don't know how well or how much better we'll be able to like deal with all of these problems that
Just like big heads, but like no like good
and
relationships.
tiny arms, and we're just going to fall over and then hop in our spaceships, right?
Yeah.
But physiologically, we're still doing the same things, and we're still doing the cortisol, and stress is stress. Yeah.
I think that's the power of naturopathy or naturopathic medicine. I mean, what's in the title? Nature pathos, or like nature healing in a sense. And what's more healing than being connected to nature in all the ways that means?
Yeah.
And
It's
one can
so
take that very
healing.
far, like being outside a lot and doing natural activities, like the hunter-gatherers. I mean, they would be doing physical activities for multiple hours every day. That's what our body's wired to do. That's what it
Yes.
wants to do.
Yes.
They would be eating foods in the natural state. They
And
wouldn't
seasonally.
and seasonally too, and for their area too. Not just like
Very
wouldn't be
niche.
eating chilies in winter in Europe.
Or eating hamburgers 365 days out of the year, if we want to make it extreme. Yeah. So I think that evolution is trying to like keep up with all these crazy fast changes, but that's the thing. Evolution is so slow.
Yeah.
Slow.
Do you think natural selection is still happening?
Yeah.
That's like the big.
I think so. Maybe not with, I think with humans for sure. I don't know. I haven't really put much thought into that, but if it's still happening, it still happens all the time with animals. We're animals. We're mammals. Like
It's weird because we're like choosing, and so the basis of natural selection is like procreation, right? And there's like sexual choice, and that's based on a lot of different factors, and like also not dying. But like pretty much,
don't die. First
don't
of
die,
all, and then
reproduce.
make babies.
Well, that's
Yes.
the whole
Yeah.
that's the whole crux of the theory. But in a world where both are easily accessible, especially in Western world, where like not dying is it's pretty easy to not die.
Yeah.
Like there's a lot of protection against dying.
Yeah.
Our
Our life expectancy, though, is now declining. Like, we were going up, and now I think we've plateaued, and we're kind of going back down to maybe where we'll even out. But that being said, just on that alone, of course, natural selection is still happening, in my opinion.
Right, but where is it heading? Are we becoming naturally selected to be like hunchbacks that like sit at computers
with upper cross syndrome?
And, like, upper cross syndrome.
I think
I just learned about that recently. I had a person I was seeing that had that, and I was like, that's an
it's a real thing. Yeah. And I think that there was a time, I think it was a Time article where they took humans now and then fast forwarded 100 years and what they think will look like in 100 years, and like that's where I said the bigger heads and the bigger eyes, that's where that came from. And so I think just based on that, natural selection is happening, and I think that whether we think we're controlling it or not, it's happening. I think sometimes that the laws of nature might be bigger or greater or stronger or more above us than we like to think that they are. Like we think that we're very intelligent, and we are, but I don't think I'll ever say that I'm more intelligent than Mother Nature. Like that was all created for us, and like we just kind of changed it and put it into a pill form and worship it now. But like at the end of the day, who created that? Not us. I don't know. That's
epigenetics. That messes the whole natural selection thing up, because some transfer of genetic material that's gained from this life. So that means that it's not only just die and procreate, but it's like how the person lived could potentially have an effect. It's interesting, when I was in university and I was taking biology classes, I walked up to one of the professors and asked him, like, because we were learning about genetics at the time, and I was really interested in epigenetics. And I was like, so what's the deal with epigenetics? Like, are people researching it? And they're like, they basically told me that it's like a very controversial field, and that a lot of biologists and scientists are doing work in secret about it.
Well,
that
just like with CRISPR, a lot of that was done in secret as well. Or with
they're saying that they're doing this one thing to get a research grant, but they're like also looking at what actually interests them, and I love that kind of beneficial subterfuge.
And I do think epigenetics is an important aspect of any health conversation because we talk about traumas that have happened generationally, and that those can still affect the person now. So what had happened to them while they were in the womb or before they were even a fetus, when they were just an egg, in the woman's body or the ovaries, what happens while they were an egg is going to still influence them if they become a fetus and then grow up to be a human, et cetera, et cetera. Like, those are things that will always be carried with them.
Right. I mean, if one can look at all of human history as like one long chain reaction, because that's kind of what it is. I mean, something that some person did, 2,000 years ago affected our lives in some very hard to perceive way. But that's how we're affecting the future.
Right.
Although we don't think of it like that because we kind of just see like what's around us and like our actions, but we don't see like you do this one thing and like 10,000 years later, like this great or terrible thing will happen. That's why I think
that's a flaw of humanity as well. Like we're really great and we're really smart and we're at the top of the food chain, but we still have flaws. And that, again, that's why I would never say that I'm smarter than Mother Nature. You know what I mean? Like, I'm not.
Mother Nature is the little intelligence that we have is purely from nature. Right. Unless one believes in the theory of the soul being separate from the body.
Exactly, yeah.
Which is an interesting theory.
And we talk about, too, epigenetics and trauma, and then inherently carrying that trauma with you, even though you might not even be aware of it. Like, your genes and your DNA literally have those kind of markings on it because of trauma that happened while you were in the womb or when you were a child, and then that influences your DNA, and then that can also cause adverse health effects. Like, that could be why a person is experiencing the problems that they're experiencing. And so, I mean, that's like a totally another separate conversation, but that's not something that should be
this is the perfect place to segue into that. So, trauma-informed care. I've heard this term, and you told me a little bit about it. But what does that mean to you?
Yeah, so I'm not an expert at all in it, but I do recognize its importance. And as a committed lifelong learner, I want to continue learning more about it and bringing that information to our community, especially naturopathic medicine. So what it means to me is kind of assuming that any person that walks into the door in the clinic or in the hospital probably has experienced some form of trauma. I don't know what that trauma might be, but I need to approach that patient with that respect and that assumption. And if they haven't experienced trauma, it's not going to make that visit or that experience any worse. It'll probably be better. But that especially matters for someone who has experienced trauma in any way, shape, or form. And then that allows you to foster that better relationship with the patient, build that rapport, build that trust, and make it be, again, less of doctor here, patient here, and more on the same level, and bringing that humanity back into healthcare. That's my opinion. And I think that the standard of care should be trauma-informed care. I think anything less than that is crap. And doing a huge disservice to so many people, because so many people have experienced trauma or will experience trauma. And to pretend like it's not a thing, as doctors working with humans, I think we're like pretending not to see something that's very clearly there.
I have a riddle for you.
Oh boy.
About trauma.
Okay.
Two people have the same experience happen to them.
Okay. One
person becomes traumatized and another person doesn't.
Yeah.
What's the difference? I've been pondering this for a while. Like, what actually, because we hear this case of, like PTSD after war, but not every soldier gets it. And some soldiers are in what would objectively seem to be way worse condition than someone who gets it. So what predisposes someone to getting trauma?
I think that also brings into the question of epigenetics and a person's genetics, and then therefore resilience or not. And then I think also their perception. How do they perceive the environment that they're bathed in? And then what does that look like in their brain? I think that every person's brain is going to have a different reaction, and that might answer your question. To people experiencing the same thing, objectively, to us, it's the same thing, but subjectively, within their brain, within their amygdala, it's perceived very differently. And that also goes back to the whole PTSD thing. Some people see beautiful colors and hear the really exciting loud noises of fireworks, and to others it brings them back to a time of war or a poor experience, et cetera, et cetera. And that's the thing about trauma. It's so individualized. Every single person is going to have different trauma, feel differently about it, experience it differently, and perceive it differently. And that also brings us to the question of reality. My reality is very different from your reality, is very different from your reality. Everybody's reality is so different. And so that riddle might not ever be solved, because the answer is always going to be like other, because there's always so much other crap that's going to be calculated and brought into that equation, if that makes sense. So I don't think I can actually answer that. I don't think that. I think it's going to be different for every single person. And that's why humanity and healthcare is so important, because each patient is an individual.
Do you think there's any way to make ourselves more resilient
against
trauma?
I do.
And what is that?
I think it depends again on the individual, but I think cognitive behavioral therapy or some form of talk therapy, or working with a professional who is able to recognize trauma and kind of help that person decipher those things and act kind of as that bridge between the individual and the trauma, is a place to begin. I think sometimes we have to also talk about medication. I think some folks need that to kind of give them their new normal, to change their threshold, and help them get into a place where they're a little bit more comfortable and a little bit more normal, and then able to work through that trauma or work through those poor experiences, and then be able to kind of reinterpret them or rewrite them, reprocess them, whatever that looks like for the individual. But I do think that there are a lot of things that we can do to be more resilient, but I think that those things are kind of happening within, and that's a lot of inner work, and there's a lot of different ways and a lot of different avenues that a person can choose to get more resilient. That's my opinion.
I would argue that all of the great spiritual paths and religious paths are the answer to that question, in a sense.
Yeah, well, I think that religion is also, and spirituality is a form of resilience.
Absolutely. So it gives the answer to how do you live in a world that has evil in it, and how do you react when that evil reaches you, in whatever form, in violence or like harassment or any form of,
and I don't know that religion or spirituality would be the only answer to those things, but I think that throughout history we have turned to those things that we believe really strongly in and strongly connect to help us get through hard times.
Right.
And I think that that's like the key piece of information, and what that looks like for each person is going to be so different, because the needs of each person or each group of people is very different. But I think that's what we lean on, and that's why it's so important too to not take that out of medicine. What do your mindfulness practices look like? And like how do you process these really hard things? And what do your support systems look like? Those are all forms of gaining resilience and changing our reactions and changing how we perceive things.
What I've noticed in cases of PTSD, especially from war, is that it's actually the senselessness of it that's the most traumatizing, not actually the violence. So if the violence is like with like a clear objective, and they know what's happening, and I have to take out that target, they're a bad person, let me take them out, okay, done. He was trying to get me, so I got him first. Less trauma than like the senseless murder of like a child for like someone in the infantry unit shot up a family just because they thought it was funny. That kind of stuff is more traumatizing, even though they're both violence and murder. And I think it has to do with the fact of like that like deeply human want for meaning, and like if it's taken away in such a senseless way, it kind of like puts a stain on all of life, because it's like, wow, that's possible, like people can do that. Why? Like it doesn't make any sense,
right? And that's also the thing about trauma. A lot of times for the perceiver of trauma, it doesn't make sense. So that's why I think therapy is so important, because you're helping
to make sense out of it.
Yeah, exactly. And putting some words and putting some like concrete feelings and shedding some light on that for a person who can't really make any sense of it. And I think too, that's kind of what's happening deep down in the brain. The brain's like, what the hell is this? Like, I don't understand. So whether it is actually a traumatic event or not, That's how it's labeled in the brain. That's how it kind of gets filed away. And then that's how someone is re-triggered or reactivated by things that have happened in their past because the brain has labeled it as such. And I know that the amygdala has a really big play in that, as well as the hippocampus, and storing those memories and labeling them and tucking them away and making those associations. It's very, very complex, and that's why I keep going back to the whole individual aspect, because for each person that's going to look so different, even if they were in the same event and experienced or perceived the same thing.
It's kind of like an adaptation, right? So like the mechanism that allows for trauma is like the mechanism that also allows for survival.
Yeah,
where
very
it's
much
like
so.
You walk into a cave and like a saber-toothed tiger bites you in the leg and like
you don't feel pain, thankfully, and you're able to get away, but because you're in shock, and then next trauma.
But next time, like you're like a little bit hesitant around caves, and you're a little bit more on edge.
Right.
And if you see a saber-toothed tiger, you're not going to try to pet it. You're just going to run, and that actually helps you.
Exactly. Yeah.
But it becomes very complex when we're humans living in society, where we have all these mechanisms, but like we're not actually under physical threat.
Right.
So it's like I'm afraid of like a bus,
Yeah.
or like I'm afraid of like a strange phobia of something that is just because it's like that mechanism of association with the danger is there.
Yeah.
So we're scared of it, but we can't run from it.
Right.
Now the worst kind of trauma is one that's based on own internal thoughts, because how can you run from your own minds?
Yeah.
Like that's basically what a panic attack is.
Yeah.
Just like trying to run away from your own thoughts. And like it's obvious what happens when you try to do that, because the more you try to run away from it, the more attention you put on it, the more you feed it.
Right.
So those kind of traumas that have to do with like internal states are especially insidious. And I don't think they were typically probably something our ancestors had to deal with, because they were too busy just being involved in the world and life to even have a chance to...
They couldn't put words or names to those experiences
Exactly.
either. Or they didn't understand, and then therefore they didn't pay attention to.
Right.
I mean, and I don't know. That's such a great question. Anthroposcopically speaking, like, were there panic attacks 2,000 years ago? Probably. Did we use the same words or verbiage to describe them now that we did back then? No, of course not. But I think it probably also looks very different now than it did back then.
Right.
And I that's our world that we're living in and that we're bathed in is so different now.
Well,
so
here's the thing, like, what is a panic attack anyway? Like, fight or flight is just going haywire, but there's no tiger and there's nowhere to run.
Yeah.
So, and then one becomes afraid of the own... So that's a big component of like panic disorders, is that one of the criteria is that they're afraid of it happening again. That's a big like major feature. So they're afraid that they'll get a debilitating panic attack in public. So the second they start feeling anxious, they have a panic attack, because they're like, oh no, not again. And like that whole thing gets triggered. In the wild, you see like, a caveman trying to spear you, and you're just like, you just start running. And it's almost like a stifled natural reaction to something. But how do you think there's a way to like undo it? I've seen a bunch of people under the supervision of attending physicians, at our clinic, with panic disorders. It's interesting how they're dealt with mostly. They're always just sent for like an EKG. Because like there's
they
no
have heart
like
palpitations,
yeah,
and
because
so that's the main
so that's
symptom.
a heart problem. It's like never actually a heart problem.
Right. So as a person with a panic disorder or anxiety disorder and PTSD, I think, I know, right? Ooh, the tables have turned. And not to make it about me, but I think that like in order to still be a functioning member of society and to be in a position to be able to cultivate a healing environment for someone, like at some point I have had to move past those traumas, or at least figure out how I can process them and deal with them and not have them turn into what I don't want them to turn into, which might be a panic attack, which might be a whole myriad of things, right? And so I don't think it's something that personally, and I'm only going to speak to this personally because I don't want to speak to everybody's trauma. I feel like that's inappropriate. But it's not something that I'll ever not have a part of me. It's always something that's going to be carried with me, but how I address it, how I face it, or how I interact with it is very different. And that has come from a lot of work that I've done. And that's why I'm such a huge proponent of therapy, or just for, mindfulness and getting back in touch with yourself. But I also don't know that I want it to be completely healed or completely cured, because it is kind of a part of me now, and maybe it's not my favorite part of myself, but I also don't want to like not recognize parts of myself just because they're inconvenient or really hard. And just like I wouldn't want to do that to a patient
It's
either.
an interesting view, because if it is something that really is a part of you, I think that's the healthy way to look at it, because otherwise you're going to be fighting a dragon that's actually your own tail.
Exactly. And that's the worst.
Rather than trying to learn how to channel that to something useful.
Exactly. And relearning those behaviors and rewiring the brain, like making new connections in my brain. And that's why I encourage others to do that too, because that's what's happening on the physiological level. And that's kind of how we cure or how we heal that.
How much do you think trauma is like one singular event versus like an overall outlook on life?
I don't know. I think that is hard, because how do we measure trauma? How do we quantify that? And then for each person, there's so much that goes into it. So for me, it wasn't like I had one traumatic event and then my life was changed. It was a series of traumatic events, and then my inability to know how to deal with those and handle those and process them, and then not processing them at all, right? And not knowing how to debrief, and not knowing my needs, and not knowing how to like reach out for help. I didn't have those skills. And so if somebody doesn't have those skills, you know, it's not like they're just gonna come up with them overnight. That's something that has to be cultivated and grown. But I think it depends. If an event is so big and so traumatic, maybe one event is all that it takes, or one instance, right? Or maybe it is a bunch of little things that add up over time, and eventually the cup overflows, and that's when we see the manifestation of the anxiety or of the creation of the PTSD. But I think that is just
fascinating.
Such a hard question, because every single person is a person. They're different from anyone else. It's not really an answer, but it's a response.
It makes sense. I view it. We were speaking before about like kind of like solution-based ways of viewing things. Yeah. And whether or not one thing causes it or not, or the specific thing is, the question for me is like, how do you resolve it in a way that's satisfactory to that person? And I think there's a lot of great traditions in philosophy. So I studied philosophy when I was in school. Stoic philosophy, this Greek philosophy. You know how the term stoic, like, oh, he's such a stoic guy. Well, that's not all it meant. That was like how they were viewed. But the whole philosophy of it was all these ways of training your mind to be able to deal with difficulty and challenge and not be perturbed and not be like shaken by misfortune. And they were incredibly interesting people that applied that. And then more of certain codes of acting, like Bushido, like the warrior's code of Japan that the samurai would follow. They had a really interesting meditative practice, if you want to hear a weird one. So they would, before battle, they would visualize themselves getting killed in all sorts of manners. Killed by arrows raining down on them, by rocks, by swords. They would visualize their bodies being dismembered, et cetera, before they went to battle. And what it did was they faced their fear outside of the battlefield
before.
So when they were actually on the battlefield and it was a question of life and death, they could just be present. And I think there's some kind of insight to like that kind of like directly facing the issue. And things like exposure therapy, where if this thing scares you and this thing traumatizes you, let's bring it in little by little by little, build up your tolerance so that one day you can overcome it. And now you just laugh at it. You're like, I don't care. That's fine.
And that's another strategy that's often used in CBT is asking the question, okay, so what would happen, or what would it look like if your worst fear kind of became your reality?
That's a scary question.
It is, right? But then it allows the person time in a space to kind of explore what that would look like, and it takes the fear out of it, because that's like, for most folks, the basis of anxiety is the fear of the unknown. If we take the unknown out of it, there goes the fear too. One way of looking at it, and it's also really successful for a lot of folks. Successful for me. If I'm really concerned about something and it's really bothering me, it's eating at me, I have to take a moment and think, okay, well, what's the worst that could happen? And whatever that worst is, what would I do? Oh, I'd still be okay. I'd still wake up tomorrow. Okay, I can move on. I can move forward and kind of put that behind me. And it's not going to engulf me, and I'm not going to be obsessed with it. But that's taken a lot of work to do. And that might not work for everybody. You know, some folks need something different. And that's why, again, I go back to it's based on the individual and what that looks like for each individual.
That's actually a thing right out of Stoic philosophy.
Really?
Right there. They had a meditative exercise that was visualize like literally the worst thing that could possibly happen and like go through to the end and see if it's really as bad as what you thought it was.
Yeah.
And usually it's like, it's fearful because like you said, it's unknown. That's a really good point. So like the thing that scares us most is because we don't know what would happen. Yeah. But if we visualize like a reality that's terrible, it's a weird kind of manifesting. I hope manifesting isn't real, because if you're manifesting like a negative state, maybe you're bringing it on yourself. I don't really believe that.
I think that's not necessarily manifesting. I think that's like exploring.
Right.
Fingers
so you
crossed.
bring up like the worst thing and you face it, and then you realize like, hey, it's actually not as scary as I thought. Yeah. So now you have no fear because you're like, yeah, I already went down that path, and like this is the worst thing that could happen, and I'm okay with it. And like 99 times out of 100, the worst thing doesn't happen.
Exactly.
Like something in the middle
But if it does,
happens.
you're prepared. Or you know what that will look like, and that unknown isn't there, so it's not so scary anymore. Yeah, a wise therapist told me that, or taught me that.
Absolutely.
And that's why in therapy they always say I'm getting a PhD in me, because you really are. You spend the whole damn time talking about yourself and figuring out what's going on up here, so that you can understand, you know, what your triggers are, or why do they trigger you. And then a lot of times too, this was also taught to me by a therapist. Recognizing, oh, hey, this is one of my triggers. And doing that gives you so much power that you likely will not even be triggered by it. Crazy. Or not that crazy, but true.
And here's the thing about triggers and trauma. Is it always the best approach to avoid them? Or can they be faced to go beyond them? Not to suggest that the actions that lead to the triggers should be perpetrated on purpose. Right. But it's kind of like this like exposure therapy for like a child or something, where you let them see the reality of the world so that they can experience and learn for themselves and kind of build up a certain kind of armor to that. But if you just shelter a child for its whole life and then you throw it out into the world, it's just going to be confused because reality was supposed to be this and that, but it's not actually that. And that causes that kind of schism.
I think it depends on what the trauma is. I think if somebody's terrified of flying on an airplane, there's a good way to go about some like exposure therapy there, right? Under the guidance or the oversight of a professional, right?
They're actually very reasonable for being afraid of being on an airplane. Like, I think it's weird to not be afraid. I personally...
Or have some reservations.
Right. I mean, you're flying in like a steel cylinder in the sky. Like, it's weird that I'm not afraid of it. Like, it's probably weirder than if somebody...
driving in a car too, right?
Well, that's way more dangerous.
But I think it depends on each individual, or on the individual trauma. You know, like I think exposure therapy, or looking at something where... and saying that exposure therapy will help depends on the trauma, right? Like some of those things are tangible and are going to be helpful and have been studied, and like there is some understanding around that. But then there are those irrational phobias or fears like that exposing that person to might not help. Maybe it will, right? But then you also have to think about risks versus benefits, right? And that's also a huge tenet in medicine. You know, I'm not going to want to expose a person to their trauma if I know it's going to do them more harm than good.
And that's kind of the trauma-informed care.
Exactly.
Of like taking that into account before.
Right. And then figuring out like what is cruel and inhumane, and then what is actually like, medicine and helpful and beneficial.
Useful
right?
for the person.
Yeah.
That's a really hard judgment call to make.
It is. And then that's too why it's so important to have this like doctor-patient therapeutic relationship, because eventually you'll get to know your patient well enough and they'll get to know you well enough where you're going to be able to navigate that situation way easier. Versus when a person just walks in the door and has this trauma and has this baggage, I'm not just going to shoot from the hip, you know, like that relationship and that understanding needs to be cultivated, and that needs to be explored.
That's the importance of that connection, because sometimes you have to challenge them and be like, this is where, like, this is what I see, and like this is this is part of the problem, or something like that.
When it's appropriate to do so,
and
when
that can
you
be
get
very
to that
offensive
part,
because it's very personal.
And that's why you have to cultivate and grow that relationship, because I don't think any patient would want you to do that right away, right before they trust you and before they understand what your role and your purpose is, and what you're looking to do.
Yeah, and an obvious example of trauma in healthcare is the typical story of, oh, you have terminal cancer, bye.
Yeah.
Like without any explanation,
Yeah.
just like dropping such a hard fact, and kind of, I mean, there's a lot of factors, lack of time, lack of compassion, whatever, but I think
burnout, but
doctor as teacher.
Yeah.
That's the solution, I
Yes.
think, that we should be educating people about their health as much as we should be administering medicines.
Yeah.
And we should be explaining what medicines we're administering and why, because it
Yeah.
makes people actually take the medicines too.
And like, what is that doing too on the physiological level when they're like truly accepting something?
And they're like, oh, this will help me with this.
Exactly.
I mean, all of research knows that. That's why the placebo control is such a big thing, because it's such a ubiquitous thing found in every kind of medicine. That it's inseparable from the actual medicine itself.
And we talk about like active patient versus passive patient when it comes to their healthcare. Like, I want a patient who's going to be actively participating, because they're going to get so much more out of it, and they're going to walk away being and feeling heard and healed, versus that patient who, I don't know what I'm taking, like just draw my blood or just give me the pills. Like and maybe that is what they need or what they want, and that's fine. Maybe that's not the patient group that I want to work with, but recognizing that active participation is huge, and that is going to be so much more conducive for healing.
Absolutely. Can you tell our audience how they can contact you?
Oh, yes.
Get more in touch.
So I'm Medicinal Mackenzie on Instagram. Feel free to direct message me or email me at medicinalmackenzie@gmail.com. I don't give any medical advice, because I am not a doctor, still a medical student. Yeah, not yet.
Just give it some time.
Yes. Hence why we're not wearing white coats right now. Yes. But please reach out, DM, and follow me on Instagram.
Yeah, thank you for being on the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah, great talk. I mean, we talked for like 2 hours before this actual recording. So
bye,
next
everyone.
time, hopefully.
Yeah.
Yes. All right.
Party.